Now let us talk about the ending. Now I hope that you have read the the document that I had sent you or emailed you, and if you have read it, I think you'll be able to understand the discussion on ending better. Now, the ending is of importance not just because the ending is dualistic, but the author himself pondered on it for several months, starting from June 1861. So, author Dickens uh, actually, before finalizing the ending, spent considerable amount of time on it. Now, primarily speaking, there are two endings, one that Dickens originally wrote, and another that Dickens altered at the suggestion of Edward Bulwer Lytton. Now, this Edward Bulwer Lytton was a novelist who was greatly admired in his day, but is less popular now, less popular than Dickens. But Dickens altered the original ending at the suggestion of this novelist Edward Bulwer Lytton. But later on, George Bernard Shaw insisted on having the original ending in a limited edition of the novel, which was published in Edinburgh in 1937. Although Shaw's position is also dualistic, because Shaw admitted that the revised ending, which is very psychologically wrong, Shaw admitted that the revised ending is very psychologically wrong, was actually artistically far more congruous in its choice and scene, hour and atmosphere. So although Shaw thought that the revised ending was psychologically wrong, Shaw was of the view, George Bernard Shaw was of the view that the revised ending was artistically far more appropriate because of its choice of scene, because of its choice of hour, and choice of atmosphere. Now, what happens, or in which atmosphere the ending takes place. I mean, the revised ending takes place. Now, when the last chapter uh, is described, uh, there is a paragraph, and let me read some portions from the paragraph. Yes, this is paragraph number 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. This is paragraph number 16. Now let me read some portions. A cold silvery mist had veiled the afternoon, and the moon was not yet up to scatter it. But the stars were shining beyond the mist, and the moon was coming, and the evening was not dark. I could trace out where every part of the old house had been, and where the brewery had been, and where the gates, and where the casks. I had done so, and was looking along the desolate garden walk, when I beheld a solitary figure in it. The figure showed itself aware of me as I advanced. It had been moving towards me, but it stood still. As I drew nearer, I saw it to be the figure of a woman. As I drew nearer yet, it was about to turn away when it stopped and let me come up with it. Then it faltered as if much surprised, and uttered my name and cried out, Estella. So, as Peep entered the house, the figure of Estella was as if coming out from a mist. So it is very symbolic, and it is hinted at that the figure of Estella was perhaps coming out from heaven, from somewhere else, from an unknown place, from a mist, which waits to meet with Peep. And the last paragraph of this chapter is also very symbolic. Let me read. I took her hand in mine, and we went out of the ruined place, and the morning mist had risen long ago when I first left the forge. So the evening mists were rising now, and in all the broad expanse of tranquil light they showed to me. I saw the shadow of no parting from her. Let me repeat the last line, which is very, very important. I saw the shadow of no parting from her. Now, this I quote from Oxford World's Classics. Now, this last line, I saw the shadow of no parting from her, is again revised. And later on, it is revised as no shadow of another parting from her. So from the shadow of no parting from her to the no shadow of another parting from her. But this was the revised ending from the original ending. Now, what was there in the original ending? Now, let me compare and contrast between the two endings that Dickens wrote. Now, in the original ending, Pip and Estella were to have one final brief meeting, and that meeting takes place years after their separation, when she was in her second happier marriage to a local doctor, local Shropshire doctor. Um, and Pip was also married too. It was assumed that Pip was also married too. There was no hint of Pip getting married to Estella. Pip meets Estella 8 years after they had first met in this revised edition or revised ending. So what happens in the original ending? In the original ending, Pip comes from London to his hometown, and Pip also kind of does the journey back and forth from Egypt. And during this time, Pip gets to, very coincidentally, Pip gets to meet Estella one fine day when Estella happens to pass by Pip's house. Now, when Pip meets Estella by chance, you may say, it is assumed that Pip is married, and Estella is also married to a local Shropshire doctor. And Pip meets Estella. This happens after 8 years when they first met after when they first met. This is the original ending. Now, what happens in the revised ending? Now, in the revised ending, Pip meets Estella in Estella's house, which is now ruined after 11 years. So Pip comes to London after 11 years. And the last line says that Pip saw no shadow of another parting from her. So this is very important. And it is hinted at that Pip is united with Estella, as opposed to the original ending where there was no hint of union. So this is the kind of comparison between the revised ending and the original ending. Now let us try to look at how critics have responded to this. Now, Bernard Shaw tried to provide his own version of the ending, right? So actually Shaw was not happy with the either endings. That's why Shaw provided his own ending, where Shaw writes, and I quote, I, that is Pip, have been able to think of her is Estella, without the old unhappiness. But I have never tried to see her again, and I know I never shall. Unquote. And in paragraph number 12, I mean, the paragraph in the revised ending, paragraph number 12 begins with, nevertheless, I knew while I said those words. Now, the document, the scanned document that I emailed you, begins from this paragraph, that is paragraph number 12, where it is written it was 4 years more. This is paragraph number 12. So here, come back, Bernard Shaw writes in paragraph number 12, it was 2 years more. Instead of Dickens says, nevertheless I know. So Dickens writes in the revised ending, nevertheless I knew, but Bernard Shaw writes it was 2 years more. Again, Bernard Shaw differs from Dickens's ending. Although Shaw, unquote, although Shaw through his version of the ending, tries to solve the ambiguity of both the Dickensian endings. Shaw's own version is also marred with the same guilt of ambiguity. So, if George Bernard Shaw thought that there is a considerable amount of ambiguity in Dickens's both endings, Shaw's own version of ending is marred with the same guilt. That is, Shaw is also has not cleared the ambiguity. Now we as careful readers of Great Expectations might decide whether the revised ending, which is bent on a happier note, is structurally and thematically fitting to the narrative or not. This we have to look at, whether the revised ending is structurally and thematically fitting to the narrative or not. In the article entitled Charles Dickens's Great Expectation, a defense of the second ending. That's a very, very good article I found on the ending of this novel. Let me repeat the name of the article: Charles Dickens's Great Expectations, a defense of the second ending. And this article was published in the journal Studies in the Novel. And the article was written by Jeremy Macier. Now, in this article, Macier argues in defending the revised edition, where Pip meets with Estella after 11 years of their separation, with an optimism of living happily ever after. Now, what is the argument that Jeremy Macier develops? Those who tend to negate the revised ending argue that the culmination is not a natural continuation of the narratorial proceedings, where Pip goes through disappointment, and this meeting with a character who had earlier insulted and belittled Pip is no more valid. So the overall tone, as some critics have held, of the narrative is that Pip continuously goes through disappointment, because he was first disappointed by Miss Havisham, then he was disappointed by Estella, then he was disappointed as he tried to become a gentleman. So a novel which has an overriding tone of disappointment cannot have this type of ending where the protagonist meets with Estella. This is the argument developed by some critics. But at the same time, when the last chapter begins, the tone is quite different. The tone of the last few passages is that of reconciliation and acceptance. Macier argues that the tone of the last few passages or the last few paragraphs is the tone of reconciliation and acceptance. In the fifth paragraph, the last chapter, BD says if you read the last chapter very carefully, BD says that BD is now married to Mr. Joe. BD says that you must marry, and BD says this to Pip. And this is very important. Critics like George Bernard Shaw, Brooks Davies, Robert Greenberg, and Milton Millerhouse. And let me repeat the names of these critics: George Bernard Shaw, Brooks Davies, Robert Greenberg, Milton Millerhouse. They tried to actually show from Dickens's second ending that Dickens wanted a greater degree of final. I mean, these critics actually wanted from Dickens's second ending a greater degree of finality and a sense of closure to a tale of relationship. And that's why these critics tried to do so through various means. Some critics tried to do so by adding some words to Pip, like Shaw did. Some critics tried to discard some words from the mouth of Pip. For example, the critic Milton Millerhouse, wants to stop at paragraph number 11 of the last chapter So Miller House thinks that the book should end with the paragraph number 11 of the last chapter. A critic like Robert Greenberg, Greenberg, critic like Robert Greenberg uh, thought that Dickens originally wanted to stop with chapter number 58. So Greenberg actually uh, wants a step forward and goes a step forward and says that Dickens actually wanted to stop with chapter number 58. He did not at all try to write the last chapter, that is chapter number 59. But if we delve deep into the narrative, we will find that stopping with chapter number 58 would have would have cut short one of the chief motives of the novel, which is return. Now, structurally speaking and also thematically speaking, one of the motives, I hope you know you know what motive is. One of the motives in the novel is return, because Pip returns continuously. Pip returns to Estella even after he is humiliated. Pip returns to Miss Havisham. Pip returns to the Joe family. So one of the chief motives of the novel is return. In chapter number 59, Pip also revisits the Satie's house to Miss Havisham for the first time in 5 chapters. In the very first chapter, Pip, then a mere boy who could be terrified easily, comes back to the unknown convict, Magwitch, for providing food and the file. So, the reunion with Estella is nothing but a prolongation of this return motif. I hope you understand. This reunion with Estella is nothing but a prolongation, is an extension of this return motive. Pip also, like his other returns to Estella. That's why this ending very much fitting. Technically and structurally speaking, the long absence from Estella, now, technically speaking, the long absence from Estella gives the latter, that is Estella, enough time to change and regroup as a character. Now, Estella, we know, is or was initially a bad character. I mean, he was kept as an instrument to be used by Miss Havisham to inflict torture upon the sterner sex of society. Now, this long absence of 11 years is actually very much instrumental, helpful for a character as bad as Estella to regroup, to change. Any lesser time or any shortage of time lesser than 11 years would have seemed quite hasty and therefore unseemly for such a wicked character as Estella initially was. In contrast, if you go back to the original ending where Dickens provides very little time, it would seem very much incongruous and highly coincidental that Pip staying at the forge of Joe, and Pip staying at the forge or staying with the Joe family is not steady, because as I told you, Pip does his journey back and forth from Egypt. It's very coincidental that Pip goes to Egypt and comes back, In these frequent journeys, one fine day, Pip very coincidentally gets to meet with Estella, and that meeting takes place when Estella was passing by Pip's house. Isn't it coincidental and highly coincidental? How do you account for it? That Pip is staying in Joe's house, and Pip's stay is not steady because he frequently goes to Egypt. He suddenly meets with Estella. So the original ending seems very much coincidental. That's why incongruous. Compared to that, this original ending, the revised ending, where Pip comes back after 11 years and stays with the Joe's family, and plans to visit the Sati's house, although the house is in ruined condition. Pip's meeting with Estella in the revised edition is very much acceptable, is very much logical, is very much causal rather than casual. Although Mr. Mackier ends his article by finding a parallel to the opening, in that both the opening and the ending portray an apparition. Now, if you compare Mr. Mackier in his article actually draws a comparison between the opening chapter and the last chapter, because in both the chapters there is an apparition. In the opening chapter, Pip meets an apparition of Magwitch, who later on turns to be the real benefactor of Pip when Pip goes to London. And in the last chapter, Pip also, as I have read from the last chapter a little while ago, Pip also gets an apparition, and from that mist or apparition comes the figure of Estella. So there is a parallel. So there is a parallel between the opening chapter and the concluding chapter. But in our ultimate analysis, we will show that whatever the purpose that Dickens had in mind, the novel is not about achievement. I mean, what Pip achieved or Pip did not achieve, whether Pip's union with Estella is fitting or not, because the novel is about aspiration. Pip's aspiration, to be particular. And we, in our final analysis, may say that the novelist or the author has not failed to portray this aspiration through the union or reunion with Estella. Thank you. If you have any questions, anything to ask me, you may ask over the telephone, or you may ask via email. Thank you.